Well, good evening and welcome. My name is Mark Laynesmith. I'm chaplain at the University of Reading. It's a delight to be here. This is Café Théologique. We've been meeting in a local bar in Reading Town Centre for a number of years, over the last couple of years, and under COVID we've obviously had to go online. So the last couple of events that we've been running have been online interviews. And I'm delighted that we've got another extra interview in the series. I'll introduce John in a moment. So can I welcome you all? A little word about the format. Tonight's Café Théologique will be a 45-minute interview to get us warmed up with John. And we'll be taking the approach really of bit of autobiography as a way into thinking about some of the topics that we'll hopefully discuss in more depth. Breakout rooms, probably of about 6 to 8 people, where I'll get you to chat with one another about the sort of questions that you want to then ask when we come back together and speak to John, and you'll have time to do that. And then we'll aim to wrap up the evening about 9 p.m. So it'll be about an hour and a half in all, or a bit shorter if you're watching the YouTube video. We will be sharing this on YouTube afterwards with a list of the questions and also some resources afterwards. So a very warm welcome to our event tonight, or whenever you're watching this online. So it gives me great delight to welcome Professor John Bryant. John is the Emeritus Professor of Cell and Molecular Biology at Exeter University. John, thanks so much for joining us this evening.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
I don't know whether this is the first online type interview you've done before in front of an audience like this.
I've spoken online at a conference recently, as you know, but I've not done an online interview. I've done a telephone interview a number of times, but not online via the magic software.
The magic software. John, tell me a little bit about your background. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Croydon on the southeast edge of London.
And I think council estate background?
Yeah. From the ages of 3 to 16, we lived in a council prefab, and then the council rehoused us in bricks and mortar, which they thought was an improvement. But since the bricks and mortar didn't have a garden, we were little more upset by it than you might have been. Yeah. So the prefabs are wonderful.
And I think you got a scholarship to go to grammar school, one of that sort of niche group of people who probably benefited from the grammar school system quite a bit.
Oh, hugely. In fact, it was an independent school who gave 12 places to the local authority to be filled based on 11 plus results. So I certainly benefited from that, without a doubt.
Was school something that you enjoyed?
Well, I love academic work and I love some sports. Socially, I would say that it was quite hard to start with, being a council estate boy in a school where 90% of the entry were fee-paying, and some very wealthy. I remember remarking to when I eventually had the confidence to sort of visit friends, that one friend had a hallway that was nearly as big as our prefab. But on the whole, school was good. And as I went through the school, I got a little group of friends around me who had similar interests in particularly in nature study and science.
How would you become attracted to nature? Should we imagine a kind of little boy in shorts walking around with a butterfly net?
Absolutely, you should. Our council estate was within 800 metres of the edge of London's green belt, and that is still green, incidentally. I looked at it on Google Earth the other day, and so we could be out there initially in what I call partly managed parkland, some for football and cricket pitches, but in wild countryside, woods and streams and stuff, and then into farmland. And I suppose if I'd chosen my route carefully, I could have probably cycled to Brighton without going through any major town from our house. So countryside was on the doorstep, and with families with no cars, but who enjoyed the countryside, we just walked in it. And then primary school kids just loved playing there. So it was just the location, and encouraged very much in my love of nature by 2 wonderful primary school teachers. You know, it all kind of came together.
What did the primary school teachers do that was particularly something that's conducive
Well, they were keen. They were nature lovers themselves, and also I think one of them in particular, as we went up through primary school, had identified a group in her class who she thought had the capabilities of going on to university, and so also encouraged us in that way. And so I owe a lot to two particular teachers at primary school.
That's often the way when I interview people, that actually it's the inspiration of a teacher
Yeah.
that can draw people on. And what was it?
I would say a very supportive mum and dad who had not been able to go on at school because of the situation. I think both quite capable of going on at school and probably of higher education these days. But they were very supportive too. I must mention them.
And was it anything in particular in nature that you were drawn to? Fauna, flora?
Well, it was almost everything. Like many primary school kids of that era, we all had to keep a wildflower diary. But I loved butterflies and moths and caterpillars, and that metamorphosis from a caterpillar to a butterfly, it seemed like magic. And indeed, now I know how it works, it still seems like magic. But also bird watching. I've been a very keen bird watcher since I was about 8, and still am a very keen bird watcher.
Winding forward a little bit, you ended up going to Cambridge where you studied natural sciences, and then you did a doctorate, and you were drawn to doing study about DNA, and I guess that was pretty cutting edge when you were doing that.
Well, hard to say really. When I went to Cambridge, I was fairly sure that I was going to come out qualified in ecology because of my love of the countryside and the natural world, but I just got hooked. I guess some very inspirational teachers, teaching in biochemistry and in genetics, and that combination of those two subjects meant that studying DNA was going to be the way forward for me. I would say we didn't feel it was cutting edge because it was all happening around us in Cambridge. That the genetic code had just been deciphered, on the last few codons were being put into place, and so it was really part of what was going on there, and I just slotted into it with the help of a very supportive supervisor.
So this was Crick was based, I think, at Cambridge at the time. Did you meet him?
He was still there. Yeah, you'd see him around, and other noteworthies like Max Perutz, a lovely humble man, Ken Drew, Sanger, Brenner. The biologists who are listening will recognise all those names. Some of them lectured to us, and we just took it for granted, shockingly.
Was there a sense of excitement, or was it as kind of just ordinary as you describe it?
Well, in a sense, it was both. You looked at these guys and you thought, well, these are really involved in working out how genes work, and yet it's part of the course we're doing. And so, the answer to the question is both yes and no. You could be blasé about it, but also excited at the same time.
Mm-hmm. The field of DNA seems to be often to draw particularly big atheist personalities. I mentioned Crick earlier, who was notoriously kind of averse to anything religious, and we think more recently Richard Dawkins as well. You've grown up in the church, though, hadn't you? I think so. This was the idea that there was a conflict wasn't really there for you.
No, it's very interesting. I've been discussing this with a friend over several weeks. That my parents were working class Christians, but they were very thoughtful, and I basically absorbed their faith. In the end, certainly took it on for myself in a gradual decision-making process, and at the same time at grammar school or independent school, two of the biologists who taught me were Christians, and so that didn't seem to me to be any problem. Relating science and faith, and I've never had a worry about evolution. It seems to me to be a lovely way that things have changed over the aeons of time, and my view of the early books of Genesis, early chapters of Genesis, were clearly written in a pre-scientific era. How could we expect them to be scientific? So I've never had that conflict. The conflict comes in different areas that we'll probably discuss later.
Did you have a moment where you had to kind of consciously reinterpret scripture? Was there a sort of a penny dropping moment of where I have to make a decision about how we read this?
No, I think what's happened is that I've learned to read it as I've gone on through science. a simplistic view that it's simply a pre-scientific account has been replaced by understanding more of the cultures surrounded the people of Israel, and also understanding things like what does the image of God mean, and what exactly are those verses trying to tell us. And so my view of Genesis has evolved. It was always based on the idea that it was not a scientific book, but it's evolved, I think, to a deeper understanding.
And that may be a little different from perhaps your father or mother's faith.
Yeah, I mean, I was never sure what my mother thought. But my father had been brought up in very non-conformist home. I think technically they were called Brethren, and being taught that Darwin was wrong, and he recanted it all anyway. And we never argued about it. Once I'd started learning about evolution, he made the point that this is what he'd been taught, and we kind of backed off any confrontation, and I'm grateful for that. I think he left me to work it out for myself in that respect.
Just turning and looking at it from the other perspective, how have perhaps atheist colleagues responded to your faith?
It's very difficult. I mean, you've mentioned Richard Dawkins. I mean, he's not really a DNA biochemist. He's more of a theoretical geneticist, and so it's a slightly different approach. Although obviously DNA lies behind everything, almost everything that genes do. But he is one of the very few, I think, who have been hostile. I've never actually met Richard Dawkins. I have worked with his first wife in Oxford as an examiner for a course. But the person who co-led my research group at Exeter, when I got too busy as head of department to run it on my own, I was joined by a younger lecturer. He's an atheist, but he's never ever felt that was a barrier to us working together, and indeed sometimes would try to hold you to what he perceived to be Christian standards of behavior.
You were kept on your toes.
Yeah, absolutely.
So after Cambridge, you went on and did a postdoctorate in East Anglia.
Yeah, that's right.
You then had 4 years as a lecturer in Nottingham,
Yeah.
and then 11 years as senior lecturer at University College in Cardiff.
Yes.
And then you go on.
Going on to Reader by the end of that time. Yeah.
And you ended up, as you mentioned a moment ago, at Exeter, and
Yes.
I think you were you were sort of headhunted there to do some research and take over the way research is being done.
Yeah, I mean, I'd been awarded a setting up grant at Cardiff, which was very gratifying because they wanted to bring in my sort of molecular biology into the plant science research and teaching program. And then at Exeter University, the university had been told by external grant-giving authorities that they must bring in my sort of biology into the teaching and research of the School of Biosciences. And I was already quite well known because of my involvement in science at a national level. And I don't know if I was the only person they headhunted, but certainly I was headhunted for that job. Yeah. And so arrived with a big setting up grant.
And you remained for the rest of your career until retirement at Exeter.
I did, yeah. And in fact, carried on teaching for quite a long time after retirement.
Yeah, old professors never die, do they?
They just smell that way.
We can edit that bit out later, John. Let's talk about your research. So when I chatted with you a couple of weeks ago, you said to me that, and indeed from your profile when I looked up your CV, you've really looked at two major areas. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about these in turn. The first thing is, I know you've looked at DNA and the way in which cells copy themselves. And then the second thing you've looked at is about plants and the way genes can get switched on and off. And there's a question there about the environment. Can we just spend maybe 5 minutes talking through those two things? So the first area was about cells copying and why things go wrong.
Yeah, I mean, I've not been mainly focusing on why things go wrong. I've been looking at when it goes right and leaving other people to look at when it goes wrong. But obviously, understanding what happens when it goes right is really a vital precursor to understanding pathology. So what we've been interested in has been, why does a cell start to copy its DNA? And it has to do that before cells can divide. Otherwise, each new cell would only have half the amount of genetic material. And it makes that decision, whether it's a plant or an animal, it makes the decision to copy its DNA several hours before the division process starts. And so there's a kind of a prediction. This cell is going to divide, and it must copy its DNA. And when I first started that research at the University of Nottingham, I think we were very naive. And essentially, we've unraveled a huge, multi-layered, complex array of sub-processes that need to happen before the cell starts copying its DNA. There's a huge number of fail-safes. I've said it before, but I'll say it again, that the cell has more fail-safes before copying its DNA than the President of the United States has before using the nuclear codes. And I'll leave you to think of the implications of that with some presidents. The interesting thing is that, you know, we can describe that process now in great detail, these layer upon layer of control mechanisms, but we still don't know what it is that makes the decision to kick the first one into action. And it's quite frustrating. For some, we know that in animal cells, the size of the cell is an indicator, but how is that size transmitted to the molecular processes? So we've spent a lot of time doing that. And I would say that what we've discovered, I and colleagues, both in the UK, in Cardiff, and across Europe, has been really quite exciting. But it still leaves questions to be answered, which is one of the lovely things about science.
And when it goes wrong, I think that this is one of the roots of cancer. So your
research... When it goes wrong, is one of the roots of cancer, yeah. And plants get cancer too, but it's not nearly so serious because plants can tolerate a good deal more deformation than animals. But when it goes wrong in animal cells, it will cause tumors of different sorts. And there are a number of different ways that it can go wrong. Cancer is not a single condition.
And so you mentioned all those fail-safes. What is it that finally bypasses some of those that causes these things?
Well, there is one major protein called p53, which is an overall regulator, which fails to stop cell division in some cancers, but there are others. It's been very interesting talking to a friend who's now thankfully in remission about some of the drugs they were using on him, and seeing how they were focusing on one of the mechanisms that we had in fact discovered in plant and yeast cells, but they were using that on mammalian cells. So that was quite encouraging. So there's a number of different steps that may go wrong in cancer. It's not just one single condition.
So that was one area of your work, and the other area has been about how plants switch their genes on and off. And there's a link here, I think, to studies about how plants are going to adapt to environmental changes.
Yes, indeed. And that started because of our work on DNA. One of the models we used for DNA replication switching on was the germinating seed, which is lying there quietly until the conditions arise. And when the right conditions arise, it's genes that regulate DNA replication, the process I've just described, get switched on. And so the idea that we can look at gene switches also struck me as very important, particularly as I'm interested in fact, committed to trying to feed the world. And if we could understand how plants respond to the environmental insults that they suffer, plants can't run away like we can, then we might be better able to feed the growing population. And so I also developed this interest in how do plants respond when they're subjected to drought or waterlogging or excess heat, all going to be very important for resilient crops in climate change.
So this is going to lead, I guess, and already will, I guess, to genetic manipulation. How can we selectively breed or maybe actually manipulate genes to make more resilient crops?
Yeah, well, we can do that. It also that and the gene switching mechanisms also led me to work on viruses. We were interested in viruses as a means, as one of the methods by which or one of the ways that plants suffer in nature. And so I worked on the RNA virus, tobacco mosaic virus. But we were also looking to see whether we could use viruses in genetic engineering. And so I've also worked on a virus called cauliflower mosaic virus, which has a DNA as its genome. Tobacco mosaic virus and coronavirus have RNAs as their genome. So the linkage of the two areas has also led me to do a little bit of work on virus molecular biology, which is kind of fortuitous in the current movement.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's brilliant that you've mentioned that. So I'm going to share a picture on the screen, and I wonder if you could tell us exactly what we're looking at. I shared this with you earlier. We've got two different viruses here, and one you said, oh, you immediately recognise that. You said, oh, well, I've worked on that. And the other one will be familiar from our TV screens. Just tell us a bit about the tobacco mosaic virus. What are we looking at when we look at that picture?
So we're looking at a simple RNA core, which doesn't have a huge number of genes on it, and each virus particle will be coated in protein. And the first thing that has to happen when the virus infects, this particular virus infects the cell, is that the virus uncoats itself, exposing its genome, which is made of RNA, but it works in the same way as DNA. And then the host, the unsuspected host cell, starts to copy that genome. And one of the products of that copying is the protein, the enzyme, that will copy the rest of the virus genome. And we discovered that enzyme. So we uncovered the mechanism by which tobacco mosaic virus, which may well be affecting your tomatoes. Anybody growing tomatoes may well find mottling of their leaves, and that'll be tobacco mosaic virus. And so it's fairly simple. It's an RNA core with a protein coat. Coronavirus is a bit more complicated because in addition to a protein coat, it has these spikes which recognize particular receptors on our mammalian cells. And it's also got a lipoprotein coating around it, which is why washing your hands destroys it, because the detergent destroys the lipid, the fat layer. So a more complicated virus, rather larger.
And so tobacco mosaic virus, I understand, was one of the first viruses to be discovered. So from the late 19th century, people began to think, well, what's causing this presumably harmful to our major cash crop? And so it led to research. And I think it wasn't until 1931 that we had the first electron microscope picture of it. And we began to see that it wasn't a bacteria. And so viruses are, and this puzzled me for quite a while until I spoke to you, viruses are sometimes described as not really alive. So they're not really living things. Can you say a bit about what strange kind of...
Yeah, they're a kind of intermediate, aren't they? Because they're neither living nor they're dead. But as soon as you put them into a host cell, the host cell will do everything that the virus can't do. So the virus hasn't got any means of having metabolism and using nutrients, but you have, or the plant cell has. And so it's using all the facilities of the host to basically copy itself. And that seems to be, the be-all and end-all of virus life, copying itself in an appropriate host. And sometimes it will live happily inside the appropriate host doing that. Most plant viruses are not lethal for the host. They reduce yield. Many animal viruses are potentially lethal to the host because of the disruption in the complex physiology. So they have some relevant molecules for life, protein and nucleic acid, and in some cases lipids, but they do not exhibit the dynamic nature of life in terms of metabolism and the ability to use what they've got. So they're kind of halfway house between living and the dead.
And so they're a parasitic entity.
Parasitic entity, yeah, we'll do that.
Entirely dependent on something else to survive, and they don't really do anything. They just for themselves, they just reproduce.
Yeah, they may kill you in doing so.
Very small. So we're talking, I think, looking at my notes, so between 20 and 300 nanometers. What sort of size?
300 nanometers is one of the giant viruses. Mostly they're rather smaller than that.
So really, really tiny. And a number of them, I understand, live on bacteria as well. So they'll parasitize bacteria. And
Oh, yes.
So this links up maybe to the way in which humans might use them to kill bacteria or deal with other things.
Oh, that's really nice. Yeah, I mean, bacteriophage, those are viruses that infect bacteria. Let's just say they're living for the minute. Bacteriophage, if we regard them as living, are the most abundant living entities on the planet. Something like 10 to the 31 individual particles out there. And bacteria, that includes the bacteriophage that infect the bacteria that infect us. So as we're all walking ecosystems, we've all got a microbiota, and hopefully, unless you've had a dodgy kebab recently, you're in quite a friendly relationship with it. But those bacteria too have their own phage, and phage therapy developed way back in the middle years of the 20th century. Is now being regarded as a way of obviating the problems caused by antibiotic resistance, that we might be able to identify bacteriophage, that is viruses that infect bacteria, to deal with particular bacterial infections, including sepsis. I think it's a really exciting process. And there have been a number of quite large-scale trials now of phage therapy. So I think you're right in saying that this is another way forward.
We don't really know how they evolved, as I understand it.
Oh.
And
That's a nice question.
he asked us, the man who should know the answer. There are various theories about how they've kind of arrived in life, what role they play.
They certainly, it looks based on the genetics of the essential proteins, it looks as if they arose very, very early in the history of life. Probably at the time before life started diverging into the various forms. That's the current thinking. So as soon as there was life to parasitize, these little chaps come along. There are also a very small number of authorities that think these were the actual precursors of living cells, but they are in a minority, and it's quite a complicated picture of how that might turn into a cell. Mm-hmm. But it looks as if they've been around a very long time, and they are everywhere.
And I understand the problem is because they don't have their own cell, they don't get preserved as fossils, so we can't see the really early stages.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But I guess we're also saying that they are, well, are we saying that they're an essential part of life, that if viruses did not exist, life itself couldn't exist? Is there that kind of dependence?
Well, certainly, if we look at our genomes, i.e. the array of genes that we each possess, nearly all organisms, higher organisms, have got some, as it were, fossilized viruses embedded in their genomes, and in many cases they're not active, and so we would call them viral pseudogenes. But there are about 7 viral genes in our genomes which actually are active, and they may well be involved in some of the early stages of embryology. So we can't say that they're not essential. We don't know whether they're essential or not, but they're certainly, the genes are active. And then, of course, you've got the lovely viral effects on those tulips from Amsterdam, those striped tulips. So that's caused by a virus condition. So very, very clearly, viruses do embed themselves in our genomes, and indeed in some cases it's actually part of the way that a virus will parasitize its host. And so anybody who is HIV positive, they're HIV positive because the virus has embedded a copy of itself, or maybe more than one, into the host genome and is able to keep on manufacturing virus particles. So they are in our genomes, sometimes as fossils that don't work, sometimes as parasites, and sometimes actually having an effect in the growth of the organism. Whether you call that essential or not, I'm not sure. I will give a puff at this stage to the Christians in Science online conference on the pandemic, and we have one from, one of the talks in the series is from a biologist, And in the resources we'll share later, you'll see the link to that conference.
Thank you, John. Just before I logged on to have a chat with you here, I was just looking at the latest statistics. So people have died in the UK since the beginning of the outbreak. What's your prognosis looking at things at the moment?
Ooh. I don't know. I have to confess. I've got some links with the front line here. That my younger son is director of public health for one of the larger non-metropolitan counties. And I was chatting with him on Saturday, as he and the family passed through on their way on holiday. In Public Health England, their feeling is there will be a second wave, because this is mainly a winter virus, and Australia has been, as it's gone into winter, has seen an increase in cases, for example. So his view is there will be a second wave, but if we are prepared for it and we're taking the relevant steps and precautions, it may well not be as dramatic as the first wave, because we now know a lot more about how to control it, wearing face coverings and all that sort of stuff.
And hopes of antiviral treatment?
Well,
vaccine?
Certainly interferon, which is a general antiviral. It has slightly different effects with different viruses, but it's a general antiviral. And the results from that trial do seem to be quite encouraging.
Is this the Oxford trial?
Oh, the Oxford trial. Well, was that the interferon trial? I can't remember. I'm also thinking of the vaccines. The Oxford vaccine also looks very promising. And what I love about the new approach to vaccines is that they're not using an antigen, i.e., the protein, spike protein, but they're using the gene that encodes it. And plants have been vaccinated against viruses in that way now for some 10 years, that you put in the gene that encodes a particular antigen and it stops the virus unpacking itself. And so the two leading vaccines at the moment are both using that approach, using the virus's genes for our cells to make the antigen to which we can make an antibody. And I'm quite hopeful that there will be a vaccine probably within the next 15 months.
Thank you, John. I'm sure people will want to ask some more questions about that, and I know that you'll probably want to sort of say, well, I'm not an expert on that as a whole, but we'll see what comes up in questions. Let's just take a step sideways into some theology for a moment. And I know, again, from chatting with you earlier, the relationship between theology and science, when we talked, you came up with sort of two perspectives. There was, as it were, a kind of dark perspective and a light one. And I wonder whether we could just talk about this for a moment. The first one you described about the violent nature of the world.
Yeah.
And your theological reflections on that. Can you say a little bit more about that, sort of the dark perspective on theology and biology?
I mean, it is very interesting. We talk of Earth being in the Goldilocks zone because the conditions for life are just right, just like baby bear's bed and porridge and stuff, the Goldilocks zone. And part of that just rightness is having a planet where the relationship between the different parts of its structure are dynamic. And so the Earth is constantly renewed, and that involves tectonic plates, a planet that is completely covered by a single layer would not be dynamic, and that inevitably involves earthquakes, and also because of the molten nature of our core, also involves volcanoes. And so the very structure of the Earth, which is really quite vital in providing the conditions for life by constantly recycling nutrients and so on, also means that life is endangered by the structure of the planet. The planet itself has I feel like a violent nature. But also the process of evolution does rely on genetic change, and it relies on networks of interactions of organisms. Genetic change may well not be a happy thing for an individual. We tend to think of humans, but other animals can also have deleterious genes. But so it's a deleterious gene that will cause sickle cell disease, or it will cause cystic fibrosis, or it will cause sex-linked haemophilia, and yet this genetic variation is part of the evolutionary process. And the other thing is the interaction of organisms. It does involve some organisms which are parasitic on others. Sometimes that parasitism is very obvious. David Attenborough has spoken about the parasite that affects the eyes of children. That's actually a small animal. But we've been talking about viruses, and we can talk about bacterial diseases and fungal diseases. Those interactions, part of the life that a fungus or a bacterium has evolved, also cause human suffering and suffering across the animal world. So there's that dark side too, that very dark side of existence.
And alongside that, so that was one part of what we spoke about. I remember when we talked. The other bit was what you described as the unlikely nature of the world, and this led in a rather different direction. Could you tell us a bit more about that as a scientist?
Yes, I mean, I'd love it if my astronomer colleague was sitting here alongside me, because he could start talking about calculated odds. But the laws of nature work at a precision which we can't even envisage. The most minute variation down to the tiniest fraction that your mind can come up with in the force of gravity, or in the forces that hold the atomic nucleus together, would result in there being no universe, either because it just flew apart or because it recondensed on itself after the Big Bang. And the precision with which those numbers are regulated is really absolutely extraordinary. John Polkinghorne, trying to give some, I don't know if you know of John Polkinghorne. When I was a PhD student in Cambridge, he was a real up-and-coming whiz kid in quantum physics, and was a fellow of the Royal Society at ridiculously early age. He gave it up and became a priest, another scientist who's got ordained. And he says, trying to give us a feel for the accuracy, he said, just imagine setting up an archery target at the other side of the universe. It's only 13.8 billion light years away. It's really quite close. And you've got your bow and arrow in your hand. You have to hit the bull. And that seems to me to be quite an extraordinary level of precision. So we have a universe which is very precise, and a number of other things. The way that carbon is made, and it has to be made in stars, and it involves a fleetingly transient energy state that only would exist in stars, that Fred Hoyle was in despair of. He said, nothing has shaken my atheism more than the synthesis of carbon, because of the very transient nature of the energy state. And we can go on and on like this. And then, as I said before, life on Earth is dependent on us being in the Goldilocks zone, or the habitable circumstellar zone. I.e., we live in a zone of a planet that's going around the sun with the right distance from it. So that's the upside. It's a beautiful set of quite extraordinary and quite unbelievable, almost literally unbelievable mathematical and physical coincidences that have led to us being here at all.
And so what does that strange, counterbalanced, light and dark kind of thing lead to you when you start thinking about God, when you approach that theologically? It's
tricky, isn't it? I mean, the more I look at the way the universe works, and indeed the more I look at the way that DNA works, it's not just life in general. The way I look at the way that life works, I share with Paul Davies. Paul Davies is an astrophysicist who studies biology and has unwillingly reached the conclusion that you have to you have to come to the conclusion that the universe looks so designed that there must be a designer. And when I look at the way that DNA works, it's highly improbable, and yet it works. So I think science on that side is giving me a picture of God, and I have no difficulty in believing in God because of what science is telling me. On the downside, though, that the universe, or particularly the planet on which we live, is a planet of suffering, very difficult to reconcile, and it's something that Christians have struggled with down the centuries. That how could a loving God set up a system like evolution, or like bacterial and viral diseases, part of life? How could a loving God do that if that God is in charge of the way that the world works?
And your response to that is, what's the next bit of the sentence?
Yeah, I think my response is in a sense on that topic, agnosticism. And people have dealt with this in a number of ways. That Jesus shared this dangerous world with us, and yes, he did. He came to a world where there were no antibiotics and people died in childbirth, etc., etc. So he has shared the messy, suffering world with us, and he's also talked about the suffering. The people who were killed when the tower fell on them, as if it's part of how things are. And Job, in a sense, in the end, was just told, "You just accept it, man. This is how it is." And yet, I also kind of know that God cares for me, and I think cares for every individual on the planet, and cares for those who are suffering. But why a caring God should have a system in which people do suffer, I think I am bound to say it would be trite to try to argue your way out of that. We can't. I think we have to say it is part of the way the world is made, and I can do no better than that. But my experience of God is that through both suffering and life in general, I have a relationship in which I understand that God cares for me.
John, I saved the last bowl for the googly for the end, and then we're going to break up.
That wasn't a googly. Okay.
No, that was an easy one. That one was, and we'll get people into breakout rooms in a minute. But so my last question for you: what's life for?
Yeah, I mean that's an extremely good question. Why is there something rather than nothing is the first thing, and we have no way of answering that question. And let's just assume there's a creator, but why would a God in outside time and outside space make anything? I have no idea. Why would there be life? What is life for? I have no idea. It's one of those deep philosophical questions that in some ways makes your stomach churn, or the hair on the back of your neck stand up. What is life for? Why has intelligent life evolved? It seems to be the purpose of the creator. Has it evolved elsewhere? Is it a key part of existence? I have no idea.
Would you see a kind of direction to the evolution of the universe which tends towards consciousness? So Teilhard de Chardin, a biologist, Jesuit priest, would say there was a sort of a direction to evolution which was about bringing us to the peak of matter, to the peak of consciousness. Would you go along with that?
That's one of the puzzles about evolution, is its directionality. I know that people like Richard Dawkins have tried to argue that it isn't directional, that it is purposeless. But I think when you look at it in detail and look at Dennis Alexander's little book, Is There Purpose in Biology, you can definitely see a movement to complexity. I mean, the Dawkins view is that the process of life is simply to replicate DNA. And the virus has nearly got it right, except it hasn't got its own means of doing it. That we're here just to replicate our DNA. We're just bags of genes, and we dance to its tune. But if that was so, then bacteria would be the only thing on the planet, because they replicate their DNA so fast, every 20 minutes. And as I mentioned dodgy kebabs earlier, if you had a dodgy kebab, you know how fast those salmonella can replicate somewhere in your intestine. So it isn't just about replicating DNA. There is a move to complexity that we see as we go through geological time. It's not that the simple organisms have gone; they're still there, but complex organisms have got more and more complex, and we see hints of sentience and consciousness in other mammals. Finally, in ourselves, consciousness at the highest level that we know of. There may be other conscious beings elsewhere in the universe, but intelligent conscious life seems to be, at the moment, the peak of the evolutionary process. And why that should be? Why should that be? It's not just about copying DNA.
And I know there's a colleague of yours, whether you know him, I think he was based in the other place in Oxford, Simon Conway Morris, talked about...
No, he's in Cambridge.
Cambridge, well, okay, I got it wrong. About convergent evolution, that for example, sharks and dolphins both evolve rather similar bodies, and therefore maybe on other planets consciousness evolves, but in rather different forms.
Possibly. I mean, he also talks about the camera eye that's evolved about 7 times. So it is possible that life always requires a Goldilocks zone. If life is as we know it, based on water and carbon, and if life is based on water and carbon, and we have to have a means of copying genetic information, it may well be that life on other planets will look like. I mean, I don't say look like in terms of the physiognomy, but in terms of the way that the cells and the organisms work, may well be similar. Who knows? We can't get there.
Thank you. We went from kebabs to stellar uncertainties in that conversation, John.
It's good. It's good. All human life is there.
So we've had 45 minutes of conversation. Thank you so much. We're going to pause now. So welcome back, folks. It's good to have you back. I hope you've had a little refreshing break and a chance to talk with yourselves, amongst yourselves, about what questions you'd like to ask. Now, just a notice on how we'll run this. If you're using your phone, if you click your finger on your phone, it'll bring up some options. And under More, you can click on Raise Hand. If I see you've raised your hand, then I'll unmute you and then you can ask your question. If you're looking at a computer screen, again, if you click on Participants, that's probably at the bottom of your screen, and then you can click on Raise Hand on the bottom left-hand corner of Participants. If none of that works, then wave vigorously at the screen and I'll see whether I can deal with it that way. So I can first hand up is I can see John Blay. So John, I'm just going to unmute you now. John, what would you like to ask?
You mentioned viruses, and I was wondering whether they're partly kind of human age-related. It seems to me as you get older, the likelihood of having a defect in the form of cancer is significantly increased, almost to the point where you can say that if you lived to 200, everybody would die of cancer. If you see what I mean. Is there some sort of something aging and in that way that makes you vulnerable?
2 things there. That there are some cancers which are actually caused by viruses. In some cases, the viruses are dormant in our genomes, as I described. Earlier, they've been kind of inserted over the course of evolution, and are sometimes reawakened by events which might be something as simple as pollution. Others are caused by an infection of a virus, and so cervical cancer, one of the forms of cervical cancer, is caused by a virus. And then in general terms, our immune system, alongside almost everything else, declines in efficiency. As we get older, we repair our DNA less well, and so more mutations occur in each of our cells, and maybe one or two of those will lead to cancer, or maybe they'll lead to a poorer functioning of the immune system, and so on. And so the overall biochemical physiological processes which are running in all of us as we speak, the biochemical noise must be ferocious. They will be declining in efficiency as we get older.
And if you, as you get older, your immune system sometimes goes wrong, and it begins to attack, something like polymyalgia, that's something that I've been suffering from, recovering from. Is that related?
It's very hard to know with these immune conditions, which, lupus, for example, is another one, can be contracted by people who are quite young. And it will be very interesting to, I don't know, I'm not an immunologist. My expertise is in DNA biochemistry and gene activity. It will be very interesting to know, though, whether there was a common factor in the range of conditions which are effectively your immune system attacking yourself. It happens in some extreme forms of coronavirus infection, is that the coronavirus triggers an immune response which is really gets gone gangbusters and starts attacking your own cells.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. Andy McQueen.
Hi. You've unmuted me.
Yep.
No. Hello, John. That was fascinating. I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about your thoughts about the dark side of the universe, of the Earth, anyhow. I'm an engineer by trade, and our raw materials for building the world and building artifacts are generated from plate tectonics.
Yes, they are. As
was the Lisbon earthquake, as the tsunami, and David Bentley Hart's had stuff to say about that. And it's an area that really fascinates me, about that way in which an apparently dark, the nature of creativity, and in the widest sense of complexity, seems to involve pain, suffering, demolition of other sentient beings and so on in that process, and how that fits into God's plan. I know you probably won't have an answer, but it seems to be another fertile avenue for exploration by more than just biologists and predation and disease.
Yes, indeed. I think Mark and I did have a little bit of a discussion of that, didn't we, before the break? I think it's a very difficult area because everything from plate tectonics through to gene change is involved in the creativity of our planet, and yet there's a dark side involved at almost every stage, and I find that really, really hard to resolve, except in my own. Let me start again. I think it's very difficult to escape the conclusion when you look at the way the world works that this has been set up. Indeed, Fred Hoyle called it a put-up job. It looks so strong that it's been set up. So I have no problem in believing in God, none whatsoever, based on the science. It's a question of where does that lead us in relation to a loving God with whom I can relate. And essentially, God has assured us that we can relate to him, her, or it. That relationship is there and it's up for grabs. So the being who is in charge is inviting me into relationship. That doesn't actually remove the suffering of people who've been swept away by a tsunami or an earthquake, or have had sickle cell disease and died. So I carry that kind of impasse in trying to resolve the two. I carry that with me as part of who I am. And I think that's the best I can say.
The rest of us can't hope for much better then. Thank you, Professor.
Well, no, and I will. I mean, if you like a book that examines these things in depth, my friend and former colleague Christopher Southgate, he's written 2 books in this area, and he grapples with this. He has a PhD in biochemistry from Cambridge, and is also a theologian. In fact, he's professor of Christian theodicy at Exeter.
Yeah.
In other words, he professor of thinking about the way that God works, if you like.
No, I've read Southgate on the issue and some of the debates around that.
Yeah.
About the place of evil, but it's just interesting. There's parallels between the animate world and the inanimate world.
Yeah. Well, Chris and I have talked many times, as you can imagine, because we ran courses together at the university. Incidentally, Mark, can I ask, am I okay visibly? The sun is setting through my study curtains behind me, and I look a bit kind of illuminated.
You look great, John, don't worry. With computers, we can make you look like anything, don't worry. Ellie, I see you got your hand up. I think you'll need to, there we go.
Yeah. Hi, so I've got a bit of a lighter question after a few
Thank you, Ellie.
in-depth questions. I'm actually going to Nottingham in September to study biotechnology. So,
fantastic.
But I was just wondering, when I was studying biology at A-level, there was a moment when me and a few Christian friends, when we were studying cell structure, when we were like, oh my gosh, there's no way that this wasn't made. Like, it was just mind-blowing the more you went into it, how incredible it was. Was there a moment when you saw that you can remember, like an exact moment where you were like, oh my gosh, there's no way that this...
I've come into science as you probably did too, as a Christian, and there've been a number of those moments. But I think this is the big one in the area, and probably the area you're interested in too. We've got this wonderful molecule called DNA. It's absolutely perfect for carrying a code and for ensuring that code is passed on to next generation. It's perfect for the job. It's the most remarkable molecule in the world. So that's in the red corner. Over in the blue corner, we've got hundreds of thousands of proteins. They're absolutely perfect for the jobs they do because of the huge variety of shapes and sizes that you can generate. To get a protein of an individual structure, the odds against even getting 10 amino acids in line are incalculable. So we've got that problem. And then the system we have in the cell is that actually this DNA codes for the order of amino acids in a protein. There is no a priori reason why that should be so. Amino acids will not line up against bases and sit there in order because the amino acids are so different in size from each other. So there's the imponderable. This has to be designed. There's no way that DNA can code for a protein without there being some mechanism for bringing those two together. So that was my kind of, oh my God, literally, my God, have you done this? This is amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Does that go with you, Ellie?
Yeah. I think for me it was the I'm going to forget the name now. The myonin moving inside of a cell and how it would move like little legs carrying things along the cell. I was just like, whoa! It's like little robots inside. It was
the microtubules, the actin-myosin system, and the little transporting. Aren't they beautiful?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, that was definitely my moment. I was like, oh my gosh, there's no way.
Have you seen the videos?
There was a great documentary with David Tennant about a virus and how it enters the cell, and it was David Tennant narrating it all, and it's about an hour and a half long, and it was really, really good. It was really good. I would highly suggest.
A good narrator too. He was, after all, the doctor.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ellie. Bosun, I can see your hands up. Other people, please do put your hands up. You don't have to be one by one. I'll come to you one by. Bosun, I think I've asked you to unmute. Can you do that?
I can.
There we go. Try again. Once more. Try again, Bosun. That's it.
There we go. Yeah, sorry, Bosun's a moniker that I just that I leave on my Zoom account.
In that case, Doug, come and ask your question, Doug. We'll make you comment.
No problem at all. You weren't to know. It's just one of those things that I should have turned off to make your life easier. John, thank you very much indeed. I find that you sort of have this problem or an unresolved two sides of a coin thing between God having made the world as it is, but it doesn't seem to quite line up with the suffering that goes on. Might there be something in making some kind of distinction between being responsible and being at fault?
Yeah. So, are we talking about the humans or God here?
God, actually.
Yeah, it's very hard to. Yeah, so is creation faulty because of its dark side, or is it that creation has to be this way to work, and therefore God is responsible but not at fault because creation has been made that works and it has to be like that? Is that how you're thinking?
Well, it's just one line of thought. I mean, I don't spend a lot of time pondering deep questions, and so I'm intrigued to understand if you might have a view in this area.
Well, what I can say is, in a sense, what I said earlier, that the Earth is as it is because it has to be this way for it to be self-renewing. Evolution is as it is because we need genetic variation in order to carry out in order to achieve the evolutionary process through natural selection. Interactions of organisms and ecosystems are as they were in order to achieve the so-called balance of nature. If there were no predators, there would be no balance of nature. So there is a sense in which nature has to be like this because that's how it is. And so we could therefore say that that God was responsible for setting the system up because that's how it has to be, and will not lay any fault down. Does that make sense to you?
Well, it's where I currently am at the moment. I was wondering whether it had merit and others might be able to see it that way.
Yeah, I think if you read Dennis Alexander's little book, which again is in the resources, you'll see he grapples with this problem. He's a biologist too, and so I think the biologists grapple with this in a sense much more than the physical scientists, despite volcanoes and tectonic plates. I think we grapple with it more because it feels so much more personal, having an illness that affects a person.
Thank you.
Doug, if that were a view you would take, I think you'd find yourself alongside the book of Isaiah. I think God says in Isaiah, I create weal and I create woe.
Yeah, and I think Job, Job is a remarkable book. And in the end, Job says, okay, God, you've got it. I wasn't there when you made this stuff.
Yeah. Thanks, Doug. Angela Wills. Angela, welcome. Let me just unmute you. And then I can see Nalini and Robert afterwards, and then Andrew. So I've got a couple of people lined up. Angela.
Hi, Angela.
Thank you, John, for a wonderful evening so far. I was just thinking, is this what Paul's talking about when he talks about the whole of creation?
Yes. People have suggested this, that there's something inherent in creation that makes it groan, but that he also said earlier in the book that God's work in the world is in this wonderful world is there for everybody to see, and so there are two different aspects of the world that Paul is highlighting. I think Paul was also highlighting the fact that humankind's activity on the planet has not been the best for it, and there is a sense in which creation groans for that, and because of that we're all waiting for God to subsume it all into a new order in which there is none of this suffering that we talk about. So he may well be, but exactly how he ascribes the cause of that groaning, I think, is a matter for debate.
Yeah, because I'm baffled. When he says it, almost says it's not creation's fault, but it's like this.
Well, I think we'd all agree. I mean, I was looking up the latest climate data earlier on this afternoon, and I think we'd all agree that humans have not really looked after God's creation in a way that God might have hoped we would.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Angela. Robert, I think it's you rather than Nalini.
Yes, I'll just repeat the thanks. It's been very interesting. I was just coming back to this thing about aging, and does the DNA have an impact? Why do well, obviously different animals live different periods, and some trees will live thousands of years, but why is it that that cell division can't keep things sort of going indefinitely?
Well, yeah, I mean, if we were to take some of my stem cells, we could probably keep them going for quite a long time, dividing. But normally those stem cells are part of a human body, which is all integrated together in a vast array of physiological processes. And what seems to happen is that individual parts of the process within an organism are determined by the genes. And so if we take a favorite experimental animal, the little nematode worm, Caenorhabditis, known affectionately as the worm, that it is a mutation of a gene in the worm that causes a longer lifespan. So the overall kind of genetic makeup of a different organism determines the mean lifespan of that organism. And that lifespan can be extended or shortened by other factors. Those other factors might be disease, they might be metabolic disorders, and so on. They might be that some people are more efficient at mending their DNA. And so it's certainly part of our genes that we have a lifespan. Whether it is 70 years and 10 or 120 or whatever it happens to be, ideally we do not know, but certainly based on our understanding of the biology of almost everything else, lifespan is built into the genes.
And I suppose that reflects back on this thing about, you were saying earlier about predators, and that if there wasn't a lifespan, at some point, whoever's top of the pile would just end up overpopulating and die out through starvation. Or
yes, indeed. I mean, it's quite interesting. There are some people in the deep ecology movement who really regard humans as just one of how many million species, and that we become a nuisance species who are over-occupying our ecological niche, and therefore we should die back rather quickly. So, and we have become the top predator in some ways, haven't we?
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you, Robert. Andrew Hornsby-Smith, welcome.
Hi, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I'm going to ask just a question that I said I wouldn't ask in the group, but I'm going to ask anyway. Do you think that a belief in God is itself a product of the evolutionary process that he set up, and a sort of two-stage, if you like, evolutionary stage, where initially he set up creation of some sort, and then he set up a sentient creation that could believe in him? So I wondered if you had any thoughts about what stage our ancestors recognized the explanation of there being a God, and any thoughts on why he would wait so long?
I mean, it is a lovely question, and that's a question I've asked
lovely
myself.
Four, actually.
Yeah, well, it's a group of questions. It's a question I've asked myself. You know, why did it take so long before conscious beings appeared on the planet? Homo sapiens has been with us about 250,000 years, 250,000 years, and Homo neanderthalis and and whatever we're going to call Denisovans, people who lived in Siberia, I don't know, but we can't push sort of human and very similar to humans back past about 500,000 years. Why did God wait that long? I don't know. I think an understanding that there might be a God behind it all has evolved. I don't think and it's evolved socially, I think, rather than genetically. There's no evidence for a religion gene. But the Neanderthals had some sense of the afterlife. They put flowers on their graves, for example, which is always an indication that there was ritual. So ritual and religion have been around since the Neanderthals, who preceded us immediately and overlap with us. So I don't think that we can see that religion has evolved in the genetic sense, but it certainly evolved in the social sense. And that presumably requires a being that is capable of abstract thought and projection in a way that non-homonyms haven't got. I think that's the best I can do there to answer that little cluster of questions.
Thank you very much. I really did appreciate that answer. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Anyway, we've got a last couple of minutes before we wrap up with tonight. Anybody else got any questions they'd like to ask? I've got one up my sleeve, but I'd like to give space to others. So just raise a hand or wave at the screen. Is that Chris Nollis? Chris, are you waving at the screen? I'm inviting you to unmute, Chris. So you have to unmute yourself from your screen. There we go. Chris, you got a question?
Yes, my question is, given where we are, where we've arrived at, both materially and religiously, have you any comments on the afterlife from your biological point of view? What can it possibly mean?
Yeah, this is a question I ask myself. Obviously, is a year's advance. I have absolutely no trouble in believing in and indeed sensing the spiritual realm. And all I can think about the afterlife and heaven is that it's almost certainly a different state of existence. It's not a continuation of the physicality. In fact, we know it isn't. So it's a different state of existence. Exactly how that will feel, I do not know. A friend of mine recently had a very, very serious surgery. She was going to die if she didn't have the surgery, and she may have died had she had during the surgery. And she asked her minister, "What is heaven like?" And of course, it's an impossible question to answer because no human has been there and come back. As Jesus pointed out in one of the parables. So all I can say is that it's an existence in God's presence in an altered state of some sort, but I cannot say any more than that.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And John, you have your hand up again, the second bite of the cherry.
It seems to me, John, that we have to accept mystery.
Yes.
Intellectually, we reach a point where people have different arguments and they just don't really get anywhere. In fact, they can cause conflict. So within our abilities, or even our very best abilities in discernment and intellectual understanding, we just have to accept mystery.
Yeah, and I'm very happy to do that. It's interesting how we accept unanswered questions in science. And there are some questions in science that I'm sure we will never answer. And so we accept mystery there. Although, as one agnostic friend of mine said, that there's rather more at stake in accepting mystery when my possible eternal fate is concerned than accepting mystery when it comes to not knowing how life began. So, there is a sense in which they're not quite parallel with each other, But I agree about accepting mystery, you know, and the sense of the numinous that some of us have from time to time. You know, what's that all about? That's mystery, and relating to something outside ourselves, which we can't define.
Thank you.
John, on that note, I'm going to share the last screen. I asked if you provide some resources for us for people who wanted to take a little further. Here we go. Do you want to say anything about these resources? These are the ones that you suggested. And also there's a conference, isn't there? I think you might want to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, Chris Southgate, very scholarly. And you know, you wouldn't want to take his books to the beach to read them.
Not holiday reading then.
but he is very, very thoughtful. Dennis Alexander, slightly different theologically than Chris, more straight down the line, I think. But he addresses the subject of suffering absolutely head on in that little book, and it's only $9.99, so well worth having. And then this conference, the Christians in Science Online conference, will be addressing the pandemic from different viewpoints, but I think looking at the three main speakers, they will all be, I think, taking on board the fact that viruses, and particularly this one, but pandemics in general, like the flu of 1918-19, have caused widespread suffering. They won't ignore that question. The first speaker is actually a volcanologist, and he might be a little bit, you might find him a bit cut and dry when it comes to biological suffering. But certainly the second and third speakers, I think you'll find very thoughtful.
Thanks, John. We'll share that on the Café Théologique Facebook page, but for those of you who haven't got access to that, I might just suggest Googling Christians in Science, God and Pandemics. I'm sure you'll find the conference there.
That will do it.
Thank you. John, it's been a huge privilege to chat with you. I've bumped into you a number of times in the past few years, and I've really enjoyed sitting down and chatting with you at conference coffee breaks. But to have an hour and a half of your time to get to question you, and to do it twice over because we rehearsed a bit, didn't we? It's been superb. So can I invite people to show in whatever way on their screens their thanks? It'd be great to do a round of applause for you.